Hello all, and welcome to this experimental program with our staff here at the Mount. We are projecting this program live about Thomas Reynolds, the gardener here at the Mount, with our staff and Nini Gilder, a local historian. So let me introduce Anne, who will be directing the panel. She is our Director of Interpretation here at the Mount. I'm sure you know her well. And I will turn everything over to Anne and enjoy the panel.
Okay, I hope everybody out there in Zoom land can hear and see us. My name is Anne Schuyler. I'm the Director of Visitor Services, as Patricia said, here at the Mount. And we are sitting on the terrace of the Mount, looking out over the beautiful garden. And this is, again, the first time that we've done sort of a joint in-person and Zoom presentation. So if there's any minor glitches, which I hope there won't be, I hope you will bear with us. So the subject of this program is our new exhibit that is actually going online exhibit, which is going up and live today. And for those of you who are watching on Zoom, we will be sending out the link later, but it'll be accessible right off of our website. And the exhibit is on Thomas Reynolds, the gardener's story, the gardener's life. And we, I'm just gonna introduce the panel, and then we'll talk a little bit about why we started, why we did this exhibit, and some of the things that we have learned and what makes him special. So Thomas Reynolds was Edith Wharton's gardener, and is at least partially, if not majorly, responsible for the beauty of her garden that we still see here today. So let me go ahead and introduce the panel. First of all, down on my right, the left of the line, is Cornelia Gilder, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. She's a local historian who has written several books on Lennox history, and most germane to this discussion, she wrote one called Edith Wharton's Lennox, which had a whole chapter on Thomas Reynolds, as well as magazine article, which she can talk about her research for that as well, focused just on Thomas Reynolds and Edith Wharton. And then next to me is Marge Cox, who is one of our docents and a genealogist extraordinaire. She did much of the original research on Thomas Reynolds, and we didn't really know very much about him except for a name. And she did a lot of the research on him that she will talk about. And then on my left, to the right of your screen, is Michelle Dempsey, who's our curatorial and program assistant. And she did a lot of the additional research and a lot of the writing and a lot of the organization of the exhibit. And down on the far end there is Nicholas Hudson, who I'm sure some of you know as well as being our supervisor of our admission, is also did a lot of research and a lot of organization on this exhibit as well. So it definitely is a work of a labor of love and teamwork to put this together. And we're actually quite happy with it. Just so I'll start out just with a little bit about what started our interest in Thomas Reynolds. So when I was doing research for another exhibit, actually about 5 years ago, in 2017, I saw in Scott Marshall's book, and I know some of you know Scott Marshall's book. Scott Marshall was one of the Mount's curators, and he had just a line mentioned, just a name. He said Thomas Reynolds was Wharton's gardener and lived in the gatehouse. And I was going, gee, I really don't know anything about Thomas Reynolds. And we were trying to develop more and more of the stories about the servants and the people who actually worked here, including the cook and the chauffeur and the butler. And he seemed to be a very important person to try to find out more about. So that kind of started our journey to try to find more about him. So I said to Marge, being the genealogist, I said, Marge, go out and try to find something about Thomas Reynolds. And I will turn that part of the story over to Marge, and she will talk about a little bit about how she started the research and where that led her.
Hi, everyone. found it very easy to do Thomas Reynolds, where some people are hidden below layers and layers and layers of reports. Thomas was quite easy to find, except it was challenging because his name when he was born was Michael Thompson Reynolds, and we knew him as Thomas. But the more I researched, I found that he was known as Michael throughout his childhood. But when he immigrated in 1896, he listed himself as Mr. T. Reynolds. And then when he, once in Lenox here, he adopted the first name of Thomas. So he was known by everyone here in Lenox as Thomas Reynolds, which is why we're using Thomas on the face, the start of the exhibit. And he led a very long and successful life, both here and when he moved to New Jersey. Married a local girl, had 5 children, and you'll find out all of that in the exhibit.
And part of what Marge did is that she contacted the Reynolds family. His granddaughter is actually in New Jersey. And they were responsible for, and they were very gracious and sent us some of the artifacts that we have taken digital images of for the exhibit. Some wonderful things that we'll talk about a little bit as we go through, and you'll also be able to see on the exhibit itself. So, Marge, you want to talk a little bit about your conversations with the descendant?
Yes. Thomas's 2 granddaughters, Dorothea Hellman and Martha Reynolds, still live in New Jersey, where Thomas worked for Drum Thwackett, and let's say that 3 times. And they are watching this evening. We made sure that they knew how to sign up for this Zoom meeting tonight. So hello, Martha. Hello, Dorothea in New Jersey.
Thank you.
And they were so kind to give us all of the things that they've sent us, family photos, and the very large wedding picture of Thomas and Eliza Reynolds when they got married on the grounds of Elm Court in 1914. So we are very grateful to them. And that's it.
So I perhaps it would help for people who don't know about Thomas Reynolds is just a very brief outline of his life. So he was born in England. All this is in the exhibit, of course, but I realize most of you haven't seen the exhibit yet. So he was born in England, in Surrey. He was born into a gardening family. His father was a gardener and his grandfather was a gardener. He apprenticed as a gardener in England, and then he came over, he emigrated to the United States when he was 21? 22. In his early 20s. He had lined up a job apparently already in Lenox, because Lenox, as you probably know, was a big gardening town. I'm going to let Mimi talk about that in a little bit. And he didn't come to the Mount initially. He worked at 2 other places in Lenox, and then when Edith Wharton built this house in 1902, she had a difficult situation with her first partner, and then she hired Reynolds in 1903, and then he stayed with her until they sold this house in 1911. And their interaction is some of what we'll talk about in the exhibit and what we'll talk about on this panel. When Wharton sold him out, Reynolds went to Drum Thwackett, which we've all loved saying. It's the estate outside of Princeton, New Jersey, and it was the estate of a very wealthy man named Moses Pine. And eventually, through the years, it was sold to the state of New Jersey, and it is now the official residence of the governor of New Jersey. So, very grand place. You can look at pictures of it, and if anybody, knows why it's called Drum Thwackett or Drum Thwackett is, you get the prize. But I think we know, but we'll tell you about it later. Anyway, he stayed at Drum Thwackett for the rest of his career and became a very respected member of the gardening community and the community itself, and died in 1959. So that's sort of a brief thumbnail of his life, and then we'll fill in some of the other pieces. I'm going to turn the mic over to Nini Builder, who is going to talk at the same time that we started doing this research on Thomas Reynolds, she was also working on her book, which has a very large section about the Mount and Mountain Gardens and sort of the whole horticultural community in Lennox. So that I'm going to turn the mic over to her.
Hello, everybody. I represent someone who actually grew up in Lennox, which may not be the case, but so I grew up hearing about these great gardeners that the estates required really, really knowledgeable horticultural practitioners, and Thomas Reynolds just fits the whole story of what I would hear from my mother, who was an avid gardener and always aspired to reach the levels of these professionals. But at that time, those flower shows were still going on in the town hall, and we would go and bring our offerings. And she would give me a sense of how revered the head gardeners or superintendents, as they were known, were. They were in a class by themselves because they were managing budgets, they were managing staff, they had to be public speakers, they were far more than just a gardener. And I think this is a beautiful story that comes through in this exhibit, because you can tell that actually Edith Wharton was the first spending the day with Thomas Reynolds and a lot of other people. I mean, they were kindred spirits, and they could talk about the flower in the cranny in the wall, or the, you know, they every little detail comes through in the exhibit. Just to give you sort of a sense of how he was part of a bigger community, and many of them were Scottish or English or maybe Irish, but this was a big group, all men, that were running these estates. And our plumber, growing up, Finley McLean, was the son of the Miss Nealon's estate superintendent. And Finley just, I would interview endlessly about this, but I remember he was just about at the end of his life when he said, I think of my father going around the greenhouse at Miss Nealon's with a very small paintbrush in the wintertime, cross-pollinating the nectarine trees. So with that,
Thank you, Nina. Yes, I mean, one thing, when you see the exhibit and we look at some of the artifacts, you understand, we all here who know Edith Wharton, she was quite the perfectionist, quite detail oriented in a lot of her life, and I think Reynolds was a kindred spirit in that too. Some of the tools, that the drawing tool that the Reynolds family graciously donated to us, you could just tell how precise he was. So I think they did have that shared. They probably got along quite well and had that shared characteristic. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Michelle, who is right next to me, and she's going to sort of specifically talk about kind of why we chose to do this exhibit this year.
Hi, everyone. So to give a little bit of backstory about how I was really interested in this, in grad school, one of my areas of concentration was the Atlantic world. So I got really interested in the interconnections between Europe and Africa and the Americas. And part of that was the spreading and sharing of knowledge about plant life. So when we started kind of doing the research for this exhibit, I mean, I could have, going on and on and on, and we have to trim quite a bit some of this backstory, which I find fascinating. But something that does come through is how connected these communities were, and how in the very beginning you needed to standardize plant names because you have people from various countries getting interested in this all at once. But in terms of how we actually started getting this exhibit together in early 2021, we were, not sure what our next exhibit was going to look like. We were, not sure what COVID was going to look like for the summer or for the season. And we had done our first exhibit online last year on the Age of Innocence, which turned out really well. So we were thinking about potentially doing something along those lines, and we started thinking about, you know, what topic could come across very well in that format. And well, we hadn't done something on gardens in quite a while. And because of COVID, you know, everyone really appreciated nature, the natural world, being outside. So we figured that this would be a good opportunity to bring that up once again. And then based on the research we had done, well, this is before I got here, but Anne, Mars, and the rest of the staff had done on the servants, we realized that Reynolds didn't have a place in the house. We mentioned other servants in various other places in the house, but Reynolds didn't have a space because he was outside in the gardens and lived in the gatehouse. And a grant opportunity came up that was for digital projects, and we applied for it, and Mass Humanities sponsored this program tonight, and we were able to get it done. And because we realized also that this collection donated by Reynolds family is really fragile, a lot of things can't really be shown on display year round. So we thought this would be a perfect opportunity to be able to put those out in the public eye for the first time.
Okay, and now I'm going to turn it over to Nick down at the end, and we'll see what he does on the interconnected note. Nick did a lot of research and does a lot of research for us about many different topics, and that's one of the things that he noticed about this exhibit too, is how everything sort of ties together. So I'll hand that to Nick.
So I guess one of my pet projects is actually trying to figure out who photographed Edith Wharton and photographed the Mount. And one of the photographers that I became interested in is Frances Benjamin Johnston, who took pictures of her gardens in France. And when you go to the exhibit, we have pictures of from Placket, which she took. There's some beautiful colored plates she made, and she was just a very famous garden photographer. She gave lectures around the country about gardening. They apparently were based in part on Edith Wharton's writings, like Italian villas and their gardens. One of the reasons these photographies have survived is because she really sold them to the Library of Congress. So, and they're mostly online, so you can search for them. She was also a favorite photographer of Beatrix Jones Farren, who was Wharton's niece and a famous landscape gardener in her own right. And she, Farren, was actually connected to the Pines. Mrs. Moses Pine, was really the reason that Farren was hired to design gardens in Princeton. So there's all these little, interests that we all have sort of came together for this exhibit.
Can I just add a word there? So my theory is that Beatrix Farren introduced Thomas Reynolds to the Pines because she was based, I think, she did a lot of work in New Jersey, and she knew Drumthorpe, and here is a garden that actually is inspired by the same garden in Italy as our Mount garden. I mean, when you see the pictures of Drumthorpe, it's eerie that he went from this garden to one that was so similar, and so I'll bet it was Beatrix that was behind it.
Yes, you might have said it, or I remember reading it somewhere that Beatrix. So when Edith Wharton in 1911, when they finally decided to sell the house, and Thomas Reynolds realized that he had to get another job, I think there was a period where they were hoping Beatrix could help find him another job somewhere. So they were probably all kindred spirits. And one of the things that, let me go back to the photograph for 1 second, because Nick talked about the photographs, a couple of the photographs. One of the other great treasures of this exhibit, which we're all quite excited about, and when you look at it online particularly, is that at about the same time this spring, when we were working on this exhibit, and some of you might know about it already, we were lucky enough to get to acquire 2 photography albums by Frances L.V. Hoppin. Frances L.V. Hoppin is the principal architect of the Mount. He did the exterior work of the Mount. This was found in Newport in an antique shop, and our great and good friend Pauline Metcalf was able to obtain these 2 albums for us. And in those albums, there are, never seen by me anyway, 2 pictures of the Mount under construction that had never been seen before. And so we were able to sneak one of those pictures in this exhibit because it shows the garden, this side of the gardens, the east side of the house with the back terraces under construction, 1902, 1903. And that all fit into the story. So it's just a great way of showing what I call the 6 degrees of separation or connection, the old Kevin Bacon thing, about how these things all interconnect. And that's always one of the fun things when you're working in exhibits, you say, oh, I know this, or look, that person is involved as well. And so that's one of the fun things about what we learned. So now I'm actually going to ask, okay, so I have to tell you that drum thwacket, anybody know what drum thwacket is? Anybody heard of it? Anybody read any Sir Walter Scott novel lately? Drum thwacket comes from a Sir Walter Scott novel, which must have been a favorite of whoever built it. And I believe it's Scots Gaelic for wooded hillside or something like that. So that's the mystery of the name, but it's a great name to say. We say a lot, so thwacket. Would thwacket be a part of the word thicket? Might be same derivation. The question was thwacket somehow part of the same derivation or same root as thicket, probably. But it's Sir Walter Scott and the Scots Gaelic, so who knows? Like, whoa. All right, so one of the things I'm going to ask the panel here is almost in every exhibit, you learn something that's really surprising, you learn something new, first of all, or you learn something that really surprises you. So I'm going to ask everybody to sort of think about what surprised them, either about Reynolds, or about the gardening world, or anything else. And so I think I'm going to start with Nick.
Well, I mean, besides all the connections I've already mentioned, the one obvious one was that we always call him Thomas Reynolds, and when we first started looking for him, it was difficult because a lot of the documents are under Michael. But once you figure out his name, I mean, it really appears everywhere. There's lots of gardening articles about him, and just really.
Yeah, well, my point's kind of connected to Nick's in that when we first started looking at some of the initial research Mark had done, we saw that in national newspaper publications like the New York Times and Washington Post, it mentions that Wharton won in this flower show for A, B, and C. But then when we started doing more digging, we found that these horticultural magazines and publications, more periodicals that were for this niche of the horticultural world, they mentioned Thomas Reynolds, gardener to Edith Wharton, won these varieties of plants. So that was pretty neat to see, and it reminded me, for all those Downton Abbey fans out there, of the Dowager winning in the flower shows when it was a different character who was in the local village. So it just reminded me of that. That was a very real reality for people.
Yeah, I know you've been researching gardens a long time and not about this exhibit, but maybe you could speak a little bit too about how I know what actually, this was somebody else who, it was Nick who mentioned it to me, of how there was a hierarchy in the gardening world as well. And even when you look at census records and things like that, you get head gardener or superintendent, and then you also get like lawn laborer and greenhouse supervisor, greenhouse foreman. And I wonder maybe you could speak a little bit to sort of like the hierarchy within the gardening world itself. Who is the big cheese, so to speak?
Well, we know that that Thomas Reynolds worked his way up, and he had experience in England, probably really mowing lawns, planting seedlings in the greenhouses, and learning from his father and grandfather. So there's all that hands-on knowledge, But when he came here to Lenox, he first worked under Alfred Wingate at Charles Lanier's property up on, which is now known as Winden Hill. He then moved over to the John Sloan place, which is just now Miraval or Cranwell to us. So he worked under two of the top men in Lenox. And he early on, when he's still, I think, at the Laniers, he joins and becomes part of the Lenox Horticultural Society. So his name shows up in references to their meetings. So I think this was a bit of a way to mingle and get to be known among the other. They spent a lot of time together, especially in the winters. They would meet in each other's greenhouses and talk Republican politics. That's another family topic. But in terms of surprises, I was so surprised to see that picture of the mount that I've never seen before. And my question is, what's the other picture?
Okay, so the other picture is Nika, our librarian, is sort of speaker of this album, but it's the picture of the front of the mount, the forecourt of the mount, with all kinds of workmen working on a scaffolding, and before they stuccoed or painted the front of the mount. So, and again, very rare that you get those kind of pictures. One of the questions we always get is like, well, who built this place and how many people were building it? And we never had any sort of visual evidence of it. So it was a great find. And the other items in that album happened to be a lot of other Hoppin work. So Francis W. Hoppin built a lot of houses in Long Island and in around Newport and in New York. And so he, as part of his work, he compiled this whole album with all kinds of pictures of interiors of other houses. And unfortunately, there's only those two of the mount, but still it's fascinating to sort of get a sense of the architectural and the garden architecture of the time. So I'm going to see Mark, if you've got any like surprising things that you learned.
I was amazed when I realized that Thomas Reynolds and 6 undergardeners took care of Mrs. Wharton's beloved gardens, the cutting and the produce gardens on the other side of the stables, the apple orchard, and 113 acres of woodland with no motorized mechanicals. Remember the lawnmowers with the blades? Amazing. That amazed me.
Okay, one of the things that
I want to do another surprise. You know, and this is a surprise for all of you in the exhibit, and when you look at the exhibit, but when we received from the Reynolds family this amazing material, it includes pressed flowers, and they're so exquisite. They are just the work of just a very careful hand, and much of them include ferns, and they don't say that they're Thomas Reynolds. Someone said, well, maybe it's Mrs. Reynolds. I don't think so. She was from a gardening family too, but I'm sure it's him. And there's a reference of Edith Wharton going out in the woods somewhere, maybe Birmingham or wherever, to dig up sweet fern. And that reminds me so much of these beautiful pressed flowers that you can see in the exhibit.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, because that was one of the reasons why a digital format, as Michelle was saying, works really well for this, because these pressed fern and wildflower sort of design would be way too fragile to try to show in person. So when you watch it online, you can really zoom in. And Reynolds, or someone, probably Reynolds, with very neat handwriting, has identified what type of ferns they are, what type of flowers they are. So again, that really speaks to his personality and his character and his tremendous precision and neatness, which masks Wharton as well. I think we have questions on the Zoom world?
Yes, excellent. I also just wanted to say we are having a few technical issues between lighting, backlighting and things. So we're trying to work them out. We are hopeful for those of you who can hear us on Zoom world that the recording will be nice and clear. Okay, and we'll post that with the link of the exhibit that is now live. Okay, this question comes from Elizabeth. She writes, I heard you say that Thomas lived in the gatehouse. Did he have a family and did they live there too? How many gardening staff work with Thomas? Marge may have answered that a bit. And where did they live? Can you tell us anything about the hierarchy there, their lifestyle, their remuneration?
Many good questions. That's actually, well, I'll take a stab at that and people can add to it as well. So that's one of the really fun stuff about one of the mysteries about Thomas Reynolds and life here in 1905 or so. Thomas Reynolds did live in the gatehouse. And those of you familiar with the gatehouse, which is now our executive offices, it's quite a large house for one person. It's four up and four down, as they say. Four rooms on the first floor, 4 rooms on the second floor, 4 bedrooms essentially on the second floor. And actually, Scott Marshall, again, one of our early curators, he said Thomas Reynolds lived in the gatehouse with his family. And we know that that's not true because Thomas Reynolds didn't get married until 1914 when he had already moved to Droghbracket. Even though he married a local girl, they never lived at the Mount. So our question always is, did he live in that big, beautiful house all by himself? Or did other people live there? And we don't really know the question to that. There was a status and there was a hierarchy. So it would not have been proper for him to have lived with, say, a laborer or a lawn, what do they call him? A lawn laborer or something like that. Because Thomas Reynolds, I think we said before, but the estate superintendent was perhaps only second to the butler in terms of, and maybe not even, maybe they were really more on equal level in terms of hierarchy and importance. Thomas Reynolds was the one that was here all year round. He was the one that had to supervise the other employees. And so he was a really important person and probably would not have shared the house with just anybody. So one of our theories is that perhaps the butler, whose name was Alfred White, might have stayed there. We're not quite sure, but that is the theory because they would have been on equal terms, and we're not aware of where Alfred White would have lived. Possibly a chief undergardener maybe, but that's really a good question. As Marge said, take 6 undergardeners, and no, we're not sure where they live. A lot of the local. Some of the servants that Wharton had would have traveled with her senior servants, like the butler, like the head housekeeper, like the lady's maid. But a lot of them were local, and so they might have lived in the village or they might have lived nearby. There are references to cottages around on the estate, although we're not exactly sure what cottages they're referring to. So I think I got all those questions. Did anyone have any add to that? What Elizabeth asked? How much he made? Oh, Michelle can answer how much he made.
I don't know if I could.
At the end of his life.
At the end of his life.
Microphone.
At the end of his life, I can't remember what the dollar amount would have been per year around 1940. But in today's equivalent, it would have been around, I think, around $40,000 is what we did research and looking at labor statistics into. And at that point in time, the average man was making like $18,000 a year. So he was doing pretty well for himself and his family by the end of his life. And again, after he left them out, he worked for the Pines, and they entertained like royalty from Europe, and they were very much a huge deal. So he moved from, he kept going up in his lifetime until the very end, and he became the caretaker for Moses Pine's daughter-in-law at the end. So
yeah, it's unfortunate we do not know. We would love to know some of that information about how much everybody made. Unfortunately, those records didn't survive. Edith didn't tell us. although, again, for those fans of Down Abbey, the highest paid servant was always the butler and the superintendent. The state superintendent would have been right up there, I think. Higher even, of course, than the head housekeeper, who was almost always a woman, and that's what it was. But also the house servants, like the butler and the head housekeeper, they also had room and board, paid for them. So that was considered part of their wages as well. Service was, as in England, service was considered a pretty good profession for middle class people, and lower working to middle class people a way up. Which also maybe brings me to the next question, or not question, but the topic of terms. We haven't talked much about Thomas Reynolds as an immigrant, but remember that he was an immigrant, and he came to this country from England by himself with 2 pieces of luggage on a ship called the RMS Teutonia, Teutonic, sorry, Teutonic, and was connected to the gardening community, but basically worked himself up to a position of tremendous respect and responsibility. One of the things that surprised me, I don't know if anybody else mentioned it, was how much he was mentioned in the press, particularly in his years in New Jersey. I mean, he was given a great deal of credit, not just in the horticultural magazines, which he was given credit for. As Michelle said, it was Thomas Reynolds who won the prizes in the horticultural magazines, where in the regular newspapers it would be the Wharton who won the prizes. But he was widely praised in the press, so he grew to a real a position of respect as an immigrant. And I don't know if anybody else has anything to add in terms of sort of that, or questions. Okay, question.
All right. From Sarah, she asked, what was Mr. Reynolds most fond of growing?
Anybody want to take that? I'm not sure I can answer that, although I will say that in the exhibit and also in the treasures that we got from the Reynolds family, there is a book called Nature's Garden. I can't remember quite the name of the book, but anyway, it's by a famous gardening author of the day. And Reynolds in the index has underlined certain plants, presumably ones that he liked, and most of them are fairly familiar to us. I think he underlined azaleas and rhododendrons, but he also underlined dandelions. So I don't know whether dandelions at the time were considered a delicacy, or something that they wanted to cultivate, or a weed. But ahead of his time. So I can't answer that question too much, except that I do think from the quote that Wharton wrote about him that they probably had very similar taste. Reynolds won, I think it was 3 or 4 years in a row. Reynolds won first prize at the Lenox Flowers show, and they're not real specific about what it was for. It's annual. We did find, at one point somebody found a seed packet for dahlias in the attic one day of the gatehouse, which probably came from Reynolds' time. And don't forget also, he would have had the greenhouse, which is right next to the gatehouse, and right next to where he lived, and that is historic. That dates from 1902 as well. So in the wintertime, he would have been nurturing roses or dahlias or certain other things that couldn't stand the harsh winter climate. I think anybody else have anything to add on that? Maybe? But I can't emphasize enough, I know Nini said this as well, how important gardens were to like the estate owners. Everybody wanted to have the best garden. So competition for people with gardening experience, particularly Scottish, English, some Irish gardeners, was fierce. Yeah.
And then also because they were presumably good at cricket.
Oh,
They were highly desired as well.
Right.
Yes, the cricket bit. Cricket was big in Lenox in the early 1900s. because a British ambassador named Malcolm Duran made an extended visit, and everybody was on cricket team. And the English, particularly immigrants who had grown up with cricket, were recruited onto the team. But it's actually a way of sort of mixing the classes, if you would, because they'd be out there on the sporting fields together, the state owner and the servants as well. So that was very much a feature. And Edith Wharton awarded a cricket bat. She donated a cricket bat. So Teddy probably played. We don't have him in any newspapers as playing, but Thomas Reynolds is listed as a participant. And Chertsey, any of our English friends might know where Chertsey is in Surrey, which is where Reynolds was born, and apparently they have a great cricket heritage. They are known for great cricketers, so Reynolds would have been quite popular. You want anything else on that?
Oh, well, so I visualize actually the estate staffs teaching the estate owners how to play cricket.
No question, Tricia.
Yes, we have several here. So Anne asks, how much money was spent on an annual basis on maintaining the gardens at the Mount? And did Thomas Reynolds import plants from other regions of the world to build these gardens?
How much money annually, I cannot say. We don't have that. The estimate is that at least initially, Wharton spent about $50,000 on establishing the garden and land and the initial landscaping. So creating all these grass terraces and things like that. We do know there's a wonderful quote that she writes also about how her royalties from House of Murray, I believe, she got a check for $1,200 and something and put it right into the garden. So the gardens were expensive. And she luckily she was making money by this time from her writings, and a lot of that actually went into the garden. So they were very expensive. And then some of you may know that Wharton moved to France after she sold this house and established gardens in several of her homes, most particularly in Chateau St. Clair, which is their house down in Sierras on the Riviera. And she probably spent every penny she had, every franc she had on that garden, because that's just she grew obsessed with those gardens, because the gardens were expensive. What was the other part? Oh, did they import? Really good question about where they got their plants from. I don't know, I mean, you know a lot of some of it.
I have one idea. So there was a nursery in Bar Harbor that George Dorr ran, and he actually spent his childhood in Lenox with his great uncles at a place that we now consider Blantyre. That in those days, the Dorr house was known as High Lawn, which is confusing. But anyway, so George B. Dorr really was the man that she would order plants from, and Beatrix Farrand was a big believer in his plants. And he would come and visit Edith here. We know that she refers to your path. I just finished making the George B. Dorr path, or whatever. So anyway, he's an interesting person who a whole book has been written about, because he is the father of Acadia National Park. But he was the plantsman that she favored, but I'm sure well.
That's good. Yeah, and if you've ever been to the Mount, you probably noticed there's a lot of vinca on the grounds. That we believe originally came from George Dorr.
Yeah, and a lot of her plants in her flower garden that we know she had. She did write this one letter, well, a couple letters probably, but the one that's most detailed is she wrote a letter to her friend Sarah Norton, and she talks about what type of flower that she had. She has a lot of English flowers that originated in England. I mean, everybody did here, you know, the hollyhock and the stocks so I'm sure there was a lot of, you know, when they were imported, we're not quite sure, but a lot of English plants that originated in Great Britain and the UK migrated their way over here. And that actually is one of the things that Michelle had talked about in the very beginning, is that the whole, you know, you look at Thomas Jefferson, who apparently smuggled, you know, rice in his pocket to bring back from France. I mean, that whole started this whole migration between the Atlantic world, particularly between Europe and the Americas, of cross-pollination of plants, so to speak. So by Wharton's time, very well established. Did you have another question?
Yes, we do. Pamela asks, did the estate superintendents of other properties socialize? If so, how? I'm particularly interested in Reynolds, if Reynolds had interaction with his neighboring estate superintendent at Erskine Park.
Meaning? I'm gonna let you handle that one.
They definitely socialized. This was a group of friends, really, and competitors, and they would have lectures on obscure topics in the winter, and Alfred Lovelace at this John Sloan's property, where Reynolds worked before coming here, was, I think, head of the Shakespeare Society of Lenox. So there was a good deal of literature that mixed with the gardening world, and church. Many of them were Episcopalians and were Anglicans and went to Trinity Church, and others were Presbyterians, and one of the Scots were out at the church on the hill. And that was a piece of their lives. And the decorating of these churches for weddings were a big thing. And some generous lady like Miss Neeland, who today no one knows because her house has been destroyed and has been subdivided. But she would offer her gardener to decorate the church for a bride that she was fond of. So there was a lot of this sort of interconnection. We know that the Lenox Horticultural Society began at Ventnor Hall in the office of John Huss, the superintendent there, which appears to be in the basement. So that's where they would gather. It's a rather grand basement. But anyway.
I think that's important to remember, that everybody else around here left in the winter, and the superintendents were the ones that stayed here. So I could see them, you know, telling tales of their employers around the fireplace and things like that. So I imagine there was quite a bit of socializing going on, and we haven't really touched on Thomas Reynolds' marriage. So he was a bachelor when he worked for Edith Wharton, but somehow he was introduced to Miss Eliza Reston, whose father worked at the great estate of Elmcourt, and in the garden, again, the whole gardening connection. And so we're not exactly sure when he met her, but sometime. And so when he went away to Drumthwacket in 1911, and then he came back to marry her in 1914. So somehow he was able to establish a relationship. And when you see an exhibit, the big wedding picture, their wedding actually took place at Elmcourt because of the connection with Eliza's father. He was an important enough member of the Elmcourt staff, so that the Vanderbilts and the Sloans allowed that wedding to happen on the grounds of Elmcourt, which was, you know, the big gorgeous estate of the time. And then all these relatives, you see the picture, there's all these people, and almost all of them have gardening connections. And so there's this whole little community of gardens. And we try to point out in the exhibit that Reynolds, you know, like had a brother-in-law who worked at Blantyre, you know, and now his father-in-law was at Elmcourt. So it developed this community of gardeners, which which, kind of still exists, right?
So, and once you really studied who were in the wedding picture, I learned that Elijah Weston's family were also connected to the Dolbys, who had a greenhouse a business in Great Barrington until really recent times. So this knowledge passed once the big estates couldn't afford to hire these superintendents. Many of them went to work for nurseries and so that was continuation.
Any other questions? Patricia, Jack?
Yes, from Daniel asking, do you know of any night blooming flowers in Edith Wharton's garden?
Night blooming flowers. Not sure. We have the Italian garden, which is all green and white. And I have heard that what is the night blooming flower? The moon,
Moonflower.
moonflower. Yeah, I've heard that, but I'm not sure if that was actually there during Wharton time. I think people have suggested we should use that, but not that I know. She used to talk, where we are right now, of course, is the terrace, and there are some great quotes from Edith Wharton herself about how she used the terrace to stargaze. She held a telescope, and it looks east over the Terringham Hills. And she wrote a poem called Moon over Terringham.
Moonrise.
Moonrise over Terringham.
Moonrise.
So you could just see her sitting here watching the moonrise over Terringham behind us, and enjoying the beauty of her garden, but by the moon. So use imagination on that,
And is there any indication that Reynolds was involved in the design of any of the gardens?
the question is for the Zoom crowd, was there any indication that Reynolds was involved in the actual design portion of it? Not that we, at least not the major part of the garden, I would say, because that was probably done already, because he didn't join Wharton until 1903. And by that time, I think the basic bones of at least the formal part of the garden. But I'm sure some of the other parts, the woodland walks and maybe the rock garden or the less some of the other outer areas, my guess would be that he had a great involvement in it. Wharton's niece, of course, Beatrix Jones Farron, was probably quite involved in the initial plan also. But we do know from he was during his lifetime and, in his New Jersey work, I'm sure he drew a lot of garden plans because we have the beautiful garden tool, or the drawing tools that his family sent us. Yes, correct.
Edith Jones was from New York City and then Boston. And so her interest in gardening, was it because when she was here and the great estates had gardens? Or what got her, was it her keeping up with, everyone says keep up with the Joneses, but was she just keeping up with the neighbors?
The question was, that Christoph here was, where was Edith Jones? Jones being her maiden name, kind of where did her gardening passion come from? And I think there's a couple of ways of looking at it. One is, as we try to say in the exhibit, her class at that time, even if she came from New York, I think there was sort of this gardening mania. And then the other thing about Edith Jones was that she spent such formative years in Europe, age 4 to age 10. And part of what she writes about when she's writing about her memoirs is wandering around the great gardens of Italy and, in France, and getting this sort of soaking up the ideas of European gardening beauty. And that was a great part of it. I think also her mother actually was quite a gardener. You want to talk about Lucretia? Her mother was Lucretia Rhinelander Jones.
Often, her mother gets short shrift, because it seems they had a falling out later in life. But Beatrix Jones Farron, she wrote sort of a little account of her life that was published after her death in her, her final Reef Point Bulletin. And in it, she actually attributes her grandmother, Edith's mother, for her love of gardens, that she would go around their place in Newport, looking at roses and things. So, well, it's speculative, and Edith Wharton never said she got her love of gardens from her mother. I think it's, very likely that that is the case.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just Wharton's, her love of beauty is indisputable. That it was one of the foundations of her life, was her love of beauty and structure, and that's always why I say that Edith loved gardens, because you have beauty and you have structure in the same practice. I think we have a couple of minutes left. We have any other
Can I
questions?
just ask Nika here about books?
Oh, I will. About what she had.
So
ask the same question
we know that she was a very sophisticated gardener from her books. And can we tell when she was collecting
Nika.
those books?
Oh, okay. You got it.
It's better to have Amazon.
So the question was, Edith Wharton has a tremendous amount of gardening books in her library. I once did a program on how many, on the female authors, the women authors in Edith Wharton's library. And what Nika and I eventually realized is that most of the women authors in Edith Wharton's library were garden writers. So there's a tremendous amount of books on garden in the library. One of the earliest ones that we highlight in the exhibit was one by, at the time, a very well-known Harvard professor named Edith Gray, and he wrote something called Botany for Young People. Now, Edith didn't get this until she was 25. This might have been a second copy. We don't know if she's gotten one when she was a younger child. But that was one of the books in the library. She also has quite a few of the works of Gertrude Chico, who was a great British pioneer of the British cottage style garden, so to speak. Wrote roses for an English garden, lilies for an English garden, color schemes for an English garden. So the big perennial, the style that we now associate sort of with British cottage style, where there's a great wave of perennial, really started with the Gertrude Chico. And both Beatrix Jones Farren and Edith Wharton were huge fans of Gertrude Chico. Wharton, the story is Wharton actually went to a garden party in England at Wanstead Wood, which was Gertrude Chico garden in Surrey, same place that Thomas Reynolds came from. Chico by this time was quite old and quite deaf and sort of snubbed Wharton, and Wharton was quite hurt about it. But they greatly admired her work. Yeah, we could do a whole separate program on sort of the book in Wharton's library that are devoted to gardening. But she had stuff about ferns and winter trees and just an incredible wide range of interest in her library.
A question from Sharon about books. Did Edith have Celia Thaxter's An Island Garden, illustrated by Child Hassan?
Say that again.
Did Edith have Celia Thaxter's An Island Garden?
Not that we know of. Not that survived. Everybody has to remember that we only have half of Wharton's library from the time of her death. So we don't know if she was familiar with it or had read it, but it's not in the collection that we now have in the library. Any other questions?
No.
Yeah, Nika.
Where did Reynolds live here at the Mount?
Reynolds lived in the gatehouse.
As a bachelor.
And again, we don't know who lived with him. We don't know whether he lived there all by himself. Again, the gatehouse guards the gate to the house. It guards the top of the driveway. So that's why he was the state superintendent. Actually, the early records of the Mount, they call what we now call the gatehouse is actually called a lodge, as in the superintendent's lodge. And almost all the estates would have had something because everybody had to have the same type of person. Any other questions? Any other questions? Anybody on the panel have? Oh, Connie.
Yes, I have a question. Did the chief gardeners share their secrets or were they competitive?
Good question. I suppose some did, some didn't. They were highly competitive.
And repeat the question.
Oh, sorry, the question was, did the head gardener, did the chief gardener share their secret, or with other gardeners, or were they highly competitive? And I can only guess they were highly competitive, but I'm sure they were probably, all these family relations, I'm sure they shared, you know, with your brother-in-law, you probably shared if you like your brother-in-law, but they did have, as Minnie's mentioned, they had this big society, the Hellenic Horticultural Society, and I can't imagine that they didn't talk about professional matters and secrets and, you know, where the best lilies were, or blah, blah, blah. I would imagine that they did that. I'm sure there were a few real cutthroats in there, but we don't think Thomas Reynolds was one of them. Yeah.
Just one comment on, somebody asked about the flowers coming in from Europe. Robert Todd Lincoln's gardens at Hildene in 1905, and a lot of those plants came from France. One of the daughters, Jessie, went over a number of times and brought them over. Some are still in bloom, the minis especially.
Yeah, by both.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know if you could hear that on Zoom, but the comment was that in Hildene, in Vermont, Robert Todd Lincoln, also magnificent gardens and imported a lot of the flowers from France in 1905. So there was a lot of cross-Atlantic traffic going on in the horticultural world of the early 1900s. All right, right before we go, just a couple of things that I want to say again to the family of the Reynolds in New Jersey is, again, thank you so much for giving us these wonderful artifacts. And I want to apologize for not having more pictures of Eliza in the exhibit. She's a beautiful woman, Eliza Weston Reynolds. And we just sort of ran out of time, or ran out of space actually in the exhibit, but it was tremendously generous of them to share their family legacy with us, and we very much appreciate it. Thank you so much.